For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. Mountain climbing offers a series of mental and physical challenges played out in some of the most beautiful places on our planet. Overcoming those challenges, feeling a sense of accomplishment, and learning a little more about yourself are tremendously rewarding. From the safety of the ground, mountains are nothing more than remarkable pieces of nature. But for those who are brave enough to summit the highest peaks and tackle the most technical routes, mountains can kill in a multitude of ways. Click the subscribe and like buttons. This is Outdoor Disasters. The incredible jagged peaks of the Grand Teton Mountains, accented with beautiful lakes, waterfalls, and rivers, making for an amazing landscape in the wide open spaces of western Wyoming, are considered one of the most dramatic mountains anywhere in the world. The Tetons were carved by ancient glaciers and stretch nearly 40 miles long. These mountains and valleys are filled with alpine lakes, many miles of hiking trails, ancient buildings by the park's first settlers, and an incredible variety of wildlife. The park includes the major peaks of the 40-mile-long Teton Range, as well as most of the northern sections of the valley known as Jackson Hole. The three Tetons, Grand, Owen, and Teton, were named in the 1800s by French trappers of the Hudson Bay Company. They called them Les Trois Tetons, which meant the three breasts. Early Native American Indians of the Shoshone tribe called the range Hoary-Headed Fathers. Few mountain ranges in the world rival the Tetons for raw beauty. The Grand Teton is the highest point in the Teton Range and the second highest in Wyoming, and it rises 7,000 feet over the valley below. Attempting to climb the Grand is a burly and dangerous endeavor with the chances of avalanches and inclement weather, including snowstorms and lightning. The appeal of the Tetons is obvious. With no foothills, the 40-mile range rises from the Earth's crust in one precipitous sweep, like an axe through a door. Upon seeing the mountains, Teddy Roosevelt is said to have remarked that they were ideal, the way a child draws them, and it's easy to see his point. The pinnacles are etched like a fever chart into the western sky. On Wednesday, July 21, 2010, the handful of parties hoping to summit the Grand Teton would all experience a mountain climber's worst nightmare. All awoke early and were camped above the timberline. Some were in a seasonal hut, others in tents. A few climbers, taking advantage of the clear night, had unrolled their sleeping bags between boulders and slept out under the stars. The day before, the forecast had been typical for the Tetons in summer, partly cloudy with a chance of thunderstorms by afternoon. But overnight, the likelihood of a storm had increased, so the commercial guides hustled their clients out of their sleeping bags at 3:30 a.m. At close to 4:30, three self-guided groups began pulling on their harnesses, helmets, and headlamps, and a half hour later they were making their way with coils of rope up through the talus and bands of cracked rock to the near vertical terrain below the summit. They were aware of clouds on the horizon, but determined to get to the top and back down before they closed in. They had less time than they imagined. Leading the first of the three groups were two brothers from Newton, Iowa, Greg and Barry Sparks, and their old friend from Bob Miller, all in their 50s. Their group was relatively large, 8 in all, and had the widest range of age and climbing experience. The 8 were relatives and church friends, such as Greg's son-in-law, Tim Vogelar, 43, a middle school art teacher. Over the years, some of them had been up Devil's Tower, Gannett Peak, and scores of Colorado's 14ers, mountains over 14,000 feet high. The Sparks group planned to climb via the Owen Spalding route, the oldest and easiest way up the Grand. This year, Barry Sparks had invited his daughter, Katie's boyfriend, Brandon Oldenkamp. He and Katie weren't engaged, but it seemed to be moving in that direction, Barry said. I hoped this trip would be a chance for him and I to get to know each other better. His prospective son-in-law jumped at the offer. The Sparks group had the whole week to work with and began with climbs of the South and Middle Tetons. Everyone made it to the top of the South Teton with no problem, but the old guys decided to conserve their energy and leave the middle to the younger four, who summited in brilliant sunshine on Tuesday. The second group, the Tyler Party, was a father and son's trip. There was Dad Stephen Tyler, his two sons Dan and Mike, their brother-in-law, Troy Smith, and a work friend of Stephen's, Henry Appleton. Stephen, 67, had always been an outdoorsman, taking Dan and Mike backpacking from an early age. Stephen had first topped out on the Grand Teton in 1966. In 1983, when Dan and Mike were 13 and 12 respectively, they'd all tried it together. Bad weather kept them from the top at that time. Still, it wasn't as if the Tylers felt they had unfinished business. They just wanted to take advantage of the fact that they'd finally found a week in which they could all climb together. Stephen Tyler and Appleton, 31, were already there, both working in Grand Teton National Park. The Tyler party also chose the Owen Spalding route. The third group, a couple and two friends from Bozeman, was led by Alan Klein, a 27-year-old climbing guide originally from Virginia. He had planned to go to Wyoming with only his friend Andrew Larson, 23, but at the last minute, Klein's girlfriend Betsy Smith, 26, and their friend Matt Walker, 21, rearranged their schedules and joined them. Klein and Smith had met in Yellowstone 3 years earlier and fallen in love over their shared love of the wilderness. The Bozeman group had climbed together too, but not in the Tetons. For their ascent, Klein settled on the Exum Ridge route. The Exum gets a little more sun than the Owen Spalding, but it's on a ridge, so there's nowhere to hide, and it's trickier to descend than other popular routes. After setting out that Wednesday morning, all three parties made good progress. By about 9 or so, the Bozeman group had made it to within 100 vertical feet of the summit. The Tyler party had made it up through the Owen Chimney, considered the hardest challenge of the route, and the Sparks group, moving a little more slowly because of its size, had just cleared the belly roll, a detached, car-sized flake of rock bisecting a narrow ledge that requires one to climb up and over it, or out and around it. The handholds are solid, but climbers are exposed to a sheer drop of 800 to 1,000 feet. For someone new to climbing, it's terrifying to anticipate and enormously rewarding to overcome. When Oldenkamp made it past the belly roll, he flashed a wide, goofy smile that made him look as if he had just won a junior high league championship with a shot at the buzzer. Though the climbing was going well, the skies were darkening, and over the next half hour, just about everyone wondered if it was time to turn back, except for Klein, who determined that it would actually be faster and safer for his crew to summit and quickly descend by the Owen Spalding route than to backtrack. By 11:30 a.m., the Tyler party had turned around. Mike set up a rappel, an anchored rope to descend on, through the Owen Chimney. He reached the bottom easily, and Dan had just started down the 80-foot chute when the first pulse of electricity coursed down over the wet rock. The Sparks group, 150 to 200 feet below the Tyler party, also felt it. "I really don't know what you'd call it. It wasn't lightning like you've never seen lightning," Vogelaar said. "It zinged down our rope. I felt it leave from my elbow, but I didn't see a flash. There was no boom that first time either." Other climbers near Vogelaar saw blue sparks and arcs around their shoes, and the jolt lifted Cameron Johnson, another member of the Sparks group, off the rock a few inches before setting him down, unscorched. "But that's when we all agreed we should go down now," Vogelaar said. The Tyler party was mostly unaffected by that first bolt, except for Appleton. His right leg was numb. Dan Tyler, hearing Appleton cry out, "I can't feel my leg, I can't feel my leg," stopped rappelling down and started back up the rope to help. He wouldn't get there. Out on the Exum Ridge, things were even direr. Thunder sounded in the clouds that had engulfed them, and Klein told his three Bozeman group partners to toss into a pile as much of their metal as possible: carabiners, cameras, pocket knives. Unfortunately, Smith forgot to remove her metal-plated wristwatch. From the clouds, there came a low, buzzing sound. Klein suggested that they step apart from each other, not that there was far for any of them to go. There were huge drops on both sides, then they stood on their climbing ropes as insulation as their pile of gear vibrated, popped, and sparked. "When we got struck, it was like slow motion," Betsy Smith said. "I was watching Alan and Walker fall, and I was thinking they're falling, but not realizing I was falling too." Though the lightning probably struck within 50 yards of them, electricity buckled their legs, leaving Smith's and Walker's completely numb. They lay on the rock where they had been standing. The charge also entered Smith's and Klein's bodies. "It was the most painful thing," Smith said. "I've been through childbirth, and that was zero compared to this. It was like someone injected hot oil directly into my veins. I was screaming." When she came to a moment later, she could see the cuff on the sleeve of her parka smoking and smell burned hair and flesh. Her own. And then, for the moment, it was almost peaceful. Clouds rushing past, wind and rain hissing on the dense rock. The climbers were still in pain, but it was subsiding, and they looked at one another with anxious relief. Hey, maybe that was it? Then the low buzzing began to build again. Some fierce storms on the Grand Teton barely registered down in the valley, but not this one. This was not the afternoon shower that frequently arrives at altitude in the Rockies and blows out an hour later, leaving blue skies in its wake. This storm was monsoonal, and it featured cells that built along a pressure front like a line of freight cars. Worst of all, these cells regenerated themselves. Dan Tyler had made it only a few feet back up the rope when lightning struck again, so close that he was showered with small rocks kicked loose by the blast, followed immediately by a deafening boom. Dan, though, wasn't conscious to hear it. "It knocked me into oblivion," he said of the lightning. "When I came to, I was hanging upside down, and for a few seconds I wasn't sure where I was. I was completely disoriented. I then realized I was hanging on the rope. The next thing I noticed was that my legs were heavy. I couldn't feel them." His right arm was dead, too. "I was unsure what to do and somewhat panicked, but I eventually realized I needed to get myself off that rope. So I fed some slack into the belaying device and was able to turn myself so my legs were below me." As Dan tried to navigate the narrow passage with a single arm, his legs were snagged against the wall and bent back unnaturally. It occurred to him that if he pressed too hard, he might break his own legs and not feel it. Maybe 5 minutes later, another lightning strike knocked some rocks loose above him. The rocks were small, but as they scattered down the chute, they added to a growing sense that the climbers were under siege. Above Mike and Dan, out of their sight, the charge had leveled Troy Smith, too. He fell, gashed his head, and stopped breathing. Steven Tyler had collapsed right next to him, and he saw Smith's eyes roll back, but he couldn't lift his own arms or move his legs. With an effort, he rolled Smith, who had fallen across his arm, and gave him mouth to mouth. After a half-dozen exhalations, Smith inhaled on his own, but he still wasn't all there. The ensuing 3 hours still do not exist in his memory. Mike couldn't see Dan, much less his dad, his brother-in-law, and Appleton, and he yelled to them over the noise of the storm, asking if they were okay. Dan and the party above yelled to each other, but neither could hear what the other said. Dan and Mike had better luck communicating and agreed that Mike should go for help. The only problem with that was that it left Dan alone and without any information about what had happened to his dad or the others. Like Mike and Dan Tyler, Greg Sparks had used the time since the first strike to lower himself and Brandon Oldenkamp down to a ledge, the very one that runs into the belly roll. Their group had decided that since Brandon was new to climbing, Greg should go down first and be there to see that Oldenkamp gained the ledge safely. Both did. Then the second bolt hit. Unlike the first one, it not only buckled their legs, but also packed a concussive punch. From 3 feet away, Greg watched helplessly as the force of the jolt propelled Oldenkamp off the ledge and over the side. To Greg's greater horror, the young man's rope did not catch and go taut. Instead, Greg could see the end of the rope on the wet stone. The rope, Greg swore, was slipped through Oldenkamp's harness loop and knotted at the end to prevent him from falling more than a few feet. Desperate, Greg craned over the cliff, but he knew it was hopeless. Below him, 800 feet down, lay the black ice couloir, a glaciated 50-degree ramp that drained over a series of cliffs into Valhalla Canyon. No surviving that. "It just took him off," Greg said months later, still with a trace of disbelief. He swore Oldenkamp was tied into the rope, which would make the fall impossible. Unless, that is, his harness failed, or the carabiner through which the rope passed had popped open, releasing the rope. Even then, the knot could have saved him. "He couldn't have unclipped," Greg said. "I'd have seen him. I was right there." He couldn't understand how it happened. He still can't. With the hand that worked best, Steven Tyler fished in his pack for his cell phone. He couldn't close his grip, and he had split his lip, so things got a little clumsy and bloody. Under different circumstances, he thought, it might have been slapstick. Eventually, he toggled to the most recent calls list and clicked on the last one he'd placed, which, he seemed to remember, had been to a ranger station for a weather update. He'd forgotten that Dan had since used the phone to check in with his wife, Heidi. So Steven's daughter-in-law, at a lodge with several of his grandchildren, picked up. He had 1 bar of wireless connectivity. No way could he risk dropping the call. As evenly as he could, he told her their situation. He did not volunteer details about Dan. He wouldn't have known what to say. Heidi's call was relayed to the Jenny Lake Rangers at 12:24 p.m. The Jenny Lake Rangers, or simply the Climbing Rangers, have evolved into one of the elite rescue teams in the world. In 1967, this elite force became renowned for a legendary rescue on the north face of the Grand Teton. 7 Rangers risked their lives to save a severely injured climber and his companion. The recovery took 3 harrowing days and pushed the team to new abilities. The legacy of this rescue was passed down throughout the years. A haven for dirtball climbers looking to get paid to hang out in the Tetons, the group has plenty of loners and mountain men, but it also has people who've done law enforcement training, a mix of type A's and poets that works. As physically fit as professional athletes, they exhibit the bonhomie of a championship ball club, rarely missing a chance to rib one another. In all, there are 4 full-timers and 14 seasonal rangers. Among them, the Climbing Rangers have amassed 230 years of experience in the Tetons. Soon after Stephen's SOS, more calls came in, and the Rangers didn't know if they were members of the same party or from different parties. In the office of the rescue cache, their headquarters at the base of Tiwanaut Mountain, northeast of the Grand Teton, the Climbing Rangers tried to make sense of what they were hearing, as there were many people on the mountain needing rescue. Ranger Jack McConnell remembers with head-shaking astonishment, "That's a bus wreck on a mountain." By the time the Rangers had a better grip on how many people they were looking for, a few of them, including McConnell and Helen Bowers, were already airborne in a chopper flown by a 30-year-old ace named Matt Hart. Though he'd been the head of the Climbing Rangers only 1 month, 34-year-old Scott Gunther had made the bold decision to launch a search and rescue operation, even though rain had begun to fall in the valley. Thunder rumbled not from far. The cache and the Grand Teton itself had vanished under a low ceiling of dark clouds. Hart flew a yellow A-Star B-3 with the doors off. That high on the Grand, there was no place for a helicopter to land, so the Rangers would have to pull people off using a procedure called the short haul. First introduced in the Tetons in 1986, short hauling involves attaching a cable to a helicopter with either a litter or a so-called screamer suit, which isn't a suit really, but a full-body harness that works well for anyone who hasn't suffered spinal injuries. The injured party has his or her arms and legs put through sewn holes and is then clipped into the cable and whisked away. "It's like a jacket diaper configuration," McConnell explains, "but it's the best ride in the Tetons, a tilt-a-whirl on steroids." A number of the Climbing Rangers had done short hauls before. Once, in 2005, the Rangers had short-hauled 13 climbers, also lightning-struck from just below the Exum Ridge. The 2005 rescue had been another long day, but that storm had swiftly blown out. The Rangers simply raced against nightfall, when it's no longer safe to fly the chopper. This time was different. Hart and the Rangers were going into the teeth of the storm. Hart's first destination was the lower saddle, one of the 2 main base camps for those climbing the Grand. Exum Mountain Guides, one of 2 commercial services with permits to guide the Grand, maintains a hut there from June to September. The service volunteered the hut as a base camp for the operation. As soon as they touched down on the lower saddle, McConnell and Bowers recruited Exum guide Dan Korn to go up the mountain with them. A sunny, highly accomplished alpinist who climbs and guides year-round, Korn, 27, had been among those who'd left for the summit at 3:30 a.m., and with 2 fit clients, been to the top and returned to the lower saddle base camp before the lightning strikes. McConnell was glad to have Korn on the search party so he could give the younger man the heaviest gear and medical kits. Within a half hour, before reaching the steepest rock faces, McConnell, Bowers, and Korn encountered Mike Tyler and a couple of members of the Sparks party on their way down. Mike had lost his gloves, so Korn gave him his. Bowers stayed with the climbers. McConnell and Korn continued on up. Luckily, they came within view of 3 other members of the Sparks group, including Vogelar, just in time. The shell-shocked trio was about to make a common but life-threatening mistake and head toward the so-called Idaho Express, a cliff that dropped several thousand feet off the Grand's west face. "Don't go down that way, it's a death trap," Korn yelled into the wind. Hearing them, Vogelaar and the others stopped and made their way to the black rock chimneys, the right way down. The storm had let up a bit, and Hart made a quick pass around the base of the summit pyramid. He soon had a bead on all the stricken climbers, but it would still be an hour or more before the Rangers could reach them and begin the short hauls. In the meantime, a second helicopter brought more Rangers to the lower saddle. They too started up. McConnell and Korn met up with the last of the Sparks group and helped them down to the hut on their own steam, and then returned to climbing in earnest. It was difficult, with water gushing down the rock and pouring from chutes in flash waterfalls. The faces they saw as they poked up out of the Owen chimney still haunt Korn. All the climbers could answer him on topic, but they were not all there. They looked like zombies. Steven Tyler and Troy Smith were especially ghoulish, bluish with cold. Blood streaked down their faces. A slush of snow and small hailstones lined the seams of their parkas. Steven told Korn he thought he'd gone hypothermic. They had a winter layer on, but they'd been in the storm for more than 3 hours without being able to move. In the mountains especially, motion is heat, and heat is life. Larson, from the Klein group, had been trying to find help, and had reached Rangers who had gathered the lightning victims and huddled with them under a slight overhang to await the helicopter. The storm had picked up force again, and they all ditched their metal. McConnell had begun to pull a tarp over one side of the overhang for a bit of extra shelter when electricity snapped at his elbow. More lightning. The morale of the group, which had greatly improved when the helicopter passed over and the Rangers arrived, sank. The Rangers were running out of time if they were to get everyone off by dark, and the urgency grew now with the intensifying storm. Hart banked the helicopter in toward the rock and dropped the cable. The screamer suit slid down the cable. McConnell detached it and tried to throw it to another Ranger, but it fell short. They scrambled for a minute while Hart tried to hold his position in the A-Star, the wind and rain whipping in his face as he flew. His co-pilot kept an eye on the tail rotor to make sure it didn't swing into the rock. That would be deadly. A stripped-down version of the A-Star had made it all the way to the summit of Everest on a 2005 stunt flight, so the aircraft had no problem with the thin air. But holding a chopper steady in those conditions takes a rare, Zen-like skill. Finally, the Rangers got the harness set between Troy Smith's legs and under his arms and hooked him to the cable with 2 big carabiners. The Rangers took a step back and waved to Hart, and the chopper whisked Smith right off the rock and out into the void. Still not comprehending that he'd been struck by lightning, Smith found the ride, as McConnell promised, awesome. He didn't scream, he gave a hoarse whoop of joy. Over the next 2 hours, all of the climbers but Dan Tyler were evacuated at least as far down as the lower saddle, where the second helicopter had begun ferrying injured climbers to the valley. For the climbing Rangers in the cache, the operation had become a logistical drama as they coordinated 70-plus people in what had become the most complex rescue in the park's 82-year history, and it wasn't over. The Ranger weatherman advised pulling the chopper out to see what the next storm cell had in store before attempting another short haul. It was like an F-16 ripping open the sky, McConnell said of that squall. It was decided that he'd head down while Rangers Drew Hardesty and Marty Vidak stayed with Dan. Some feeling had returned to Dan's arms and legs, and he could wiggle his toes a little, but he was terribly cold. McConnell told them he really hated to be going so soon. Dan appreciated the humor, but he really wanted off that mountain. He couldn't face the prospect of being out overnight, and it was starting to get dim. For Dan, the helicopter hadn't just represented hope, it was hope, and now it was leaving. His despair didn't last long. Within the hour, Hart had taken advantage of another short window in the storm to return and pluck Dan off. Dan did not enjoy the short-haul ride nearly as much as his brother-in-law had. Out in the vast space over all that rock and snow of the Tetons, he had trouble breathing. He shivered and closed his eyes until it was over. It was just too much. Dan only spent 15 minutes in the base camp hut, just long enough to be stuffed into a sleeping bag and given a cup of hot chocolate. He still couldn't walk, but he was feeling like he would eventually. Once in the valley, the EMTs ran an IV into him and had him wait in an ambulance. It's a 30-minute drive to the hospital, so the Rangers had to take more than one at a time. A few minutes passed, they opened up the back of the ambulance, and his dad entered. The old man was roughed up, split lip, dried blood on his nose, some loss of hearing, but he'd made it. Dan broke down. He had never been happier to see his dad in his life. The following morning, Hart started up the A-Star again for the grim trip out to Valhalla Canyon to recover Brandon Oldenkamp's body. Like all the climbing rangers, Hart knew well that adventures in the mountains could carry fateful consequences. The park averages 1 to 3 deaths per year, statistically not bad perhaps given the 4 million visitors. But Hart found Oldenkamp's death profoundly sad. At least he and the other rangers had been able to save the lives of a handful more. Hypothermia and other injuries could have proved fatal to several of the lightning victims had there not been a helicopter to get them down fast. Several of the climbers were back at their lodge rooms by 9 or 10 that night, but a few had more serious medical issues. Troy Smith turned out to be okay, but would be loopy for weeks. Betsy Smith lost the index finger on her right hand, where the charge had exited her body, killing all the tissue. The finger had to be amputated and stitched up. Her wristwatch had burned her left arm severely. The arm was so swollen that surgeons had to cut it to keep blood flowing into her left hand. Only Alan Klein ended up in the ICU. He had burns across his back and probably should have died. The electricity that had coursed through him had torn his lungs slightly, allowing air to seep into his chest and put pressure on his heart, which was beating at only 35 beats per minute when he was admitted to the hospital. The doctor who saw me told me I had more air in my chest than anyone he'd ever seen who wasn't dead, Klein says. 1 year later, Steven Tyler still can't hear as well, though he's not sure if that's all from the lightning or from turning 68. Most of the rest have made a full recovery, at least physically. Several have continued climbing. For Klein, it's his livelihood. Others have forsworn it, or plan to do less ambitious hikes, all under blue skies, thank you very much. Asked if he'd attempt the Grand again, Mike Tyler says, "No, I think we got the message." The ranger who coordinated the rescue from headquarters, Jim Springer, investigated why Oldenkamp's rope and harness hadn't broken his fall. It appeared Oldenkamp might have passed the rope through a weaker loop on his harness, one not designed to take his weight. Or maybe the rope slipped out of the carabiner on his harness, which had been found unlocked. Or maybe, reaching the ledge, Oldenkamp had simply unclipped from the rope. Oldenkamp was devoted to God, and his family says his faith, and theirs, has helped them earn a measure of peace. "I still weep sometimes," his father, Bob Oldenkamp, says. "We weren't ready for him to go. But I do know that in those mountains, Brandon saw the best the Creator has ever made, and in a heartbeat, he got to see him who made it." Blinding and explosive, here and gone in 0.2 of a second, lightning is the hottest natural force on the face of the Earth. Nuclear energy can be hotter, but that's artificial. The precise genesis of lightning is not known, but it initially involves the friction of millions of ice crystals in clouds. Lightning comes in many forms and has a variety of strengths, from a weak 100-ampere flicker to a 1,000-amp streamer to a cloud-to-ground stroke that reaches 300,000 amps and 50,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The National Weather Service estimates that lightning kills 55 people in the United States per year, many of them boaters, golfers, and farmers. And many, like the climbers on the Grand Teton during this incident, don't experience a direct hit, but rather ground shocks, electricity running over or through the earth. Even so, more than half of those who endure a direct strike survive. The rule of thumb many of us learned as children, counting 1/1000 for each second between the flash and the sound of thunder to determine how many miles away the lightning is off by a factor of 5. Every 5 seconds is the equivalent of 1 mile. 1 second between a flash and thunderclap means that the lightning could have hit less than a quarter mile away. Keep these things in mind to avoid an outdoor disaster. Thank you for watching. Want more outdoor disaster content? Check out these stories I believe you'll enjoy.